Hi everyone. Since no one has signed up to do this particular article, I am going to give you a video with some things to think about with the Everett article that we're reading for today's class. It's not going to be a formal presentation like the ones that I'm asking you to do, and I'm not going to supply a handout. So if the class were meeting in person, this is a day that we would just have a regular informal discussion and I would participate and lead that, but without the sort of like rigorous expectations of an in-class presentation from one of you. So I have some notes that I'm going to be referring to for the article. And I came across this article because of my own research into George Crumb and his use of both the concept of the grotesque and musical parody and musical quotation in his works. So that's how I've come to know this article, and it's been really helpful for me. I want to give you a little bit of background about the author and tell you that Dr. Everett is on faculty at University of Illinois Chicago, and she studies a diverse set of music theory concepts and literature. Mostly, though, you can tell from her bio, she studies mostly like 20th century music after World War II, and she's less interested in things like pitch sets and more interested in things like semiotics, as in how do these things acquire meaning. And those are topics that we will definitely talk about that I'll address in this video and that you will want to talk about in your discussion posts about it. So to start with, this article focuses on Ligeti and his Opera Le Grand Macabre, and there's actually an excellent book out about that now, so I will link to that as well. That's just about the grotesque in Ligeti's music. You might know of Ligeti as a post-war Hungarian composer, and both of the articles that we're reading for this week focus on Ligeti. So within his body of work, she is really interested in how he uses quotation and parody in the 1960s and 70s and beyond that, especially for social critique. So he doesn't just quote things and he doesn't just like satirize things, other music. He does it for the purpose of some kind of social critique of basically like Western society in some way. In order to get at how the grotesque works in Ligeti's music, Everett looks at or employs Bakhtin's concept of grotesque realism. Bakhtin, of course, being one of our kind of like post-war social critics who wrote you might group in with like as a cultural critic, the way that we talk about people like Foucault. So Bakhtin talks about the grotesque in a really particular way, and so relates it to the folk humor of the Middle Ages, which kind of makes this Ligeti opera, which is very strange, make a little bit more sense because it draws on all these different time periods. And the idea with Bakhtin and the grotesque is, I always think of this quote, a lowering of all that is high. So you could take something that has like really high social status and downgrade it or put it in what we would think of as like a vulgar social context, basically. She's quoting Bakhtin saying that a lowering of all that is high, spiritual, ideal, and abstract is a transfer to the material level, to the sphere of earth and body in their indissoluble unity. And you can think of like grotesque medieval and Renaissance paintings where like there'll be some weird body that has its mouth open and there's demons like falling out of it. That would be an example of the grotesque. There's a lot of like the body. When I say the body, I mean bodies abstractly, and it's hard to talk about that in an equitable way because not everybody's bodies are the same, and they certainly haven't all been treated the same throughout history, but the idea is taking some kind of bodily experience into account when you analyze something or talk about it critically. So Bakhtin talks about how in the Renaissance, writers are interested in the body or rehabilitation of the flesh as a reaction against medieval asceticism. So the idea is that your body is like this thing that's part of like celebration, and it's exaggerated and it's macabre and it's gross and it's like big and out of control kind of. So everything is exaggerated to make that point. Okay, so in grotesque realism, I'm on page 29, In grotesque realism, death assumes a positive characteristic because it celebrates the regeneration of life. So the idea is that, like, death isn't necessarily bad in this context because you're rotting. I shouldn't say you are. Death isn't necessarily bad in this context because one's rotting flesh will lead to, like, regeneration in the soil and things like that. And so there's a visual celebration of, like, gross scenes of decomposition and things like that. In artistic rendering, if we celebrate that, then there's less of a distance between the living and the dead, and that's an important part of understanding how the grotesque works in a lot of music, I think. I mean, it's something that we get excited about around Halloween, right? We're like, ooh, there's less of a barrier between humans and ghosts. And even if you don't really believe that, it's something that's interesting to think about from an, like, artistic perspective. She talks about two levels of analysis that she's going to focus on that were relevant to me. A surface level at which Ligeti transforms musical parody and subverts quotation of existing music and style. So he's still going to use those things, but subverting the way that they're normally used. And a global level at which he articulates the trope of the grotesque by establishing an expressive opposition between ludicrousness and horror. So ludicrousness is in just being the silliest, wackiest, goofiest things you can think of, and a horror movie. Those aren't things that you typically think of going together, and it's that kind of weird combination where they don't fit that makes it gives it a new meaning. So there's a sense then that exaggeration is a big part of this. We're going to take two things that don't go together and put them together, and in order to really heighten the sense of their conflict, we're going to make them both even bigger, more exaggerated, more ludicrous, and more horrific as you put them together. And here she's quoting someone on page 32, saying the idea is that when we hear this setting, we recall the original meaning of a piece of music or a song or whatever, and then that old meaning is negated, and new satirical meaning comes up. And so that's a kind of double meaning that a piece can have. So, for example, in Nightmare Before Christmas, when they have that little street band, it's playing Here Comes Santa Claus in a minor key, and it's very weird. Here Comes Santa Claus doesn't belong in this, like, ultra goth Halloween world, and so it's taken out of that setting and put in this new one where it's put in a minor key and it's being played by these kind of monstrous characters, and it gets a new meaning that's somehow like a premonition that Christmas isn't going to turn out the way all the Halloween people think it's going to. But that's an idea of how its original meaning of, like, here comes Santa Claus and that's going to be so fun is negated, and its new satirical meaning is here comes Jack dressed as Santa Claus and he's here to, like, gothify and ruin everyone's Christmas. So that would be an example of how this particular kind of double meaning can emerge. But you have to know that original source material to understand why that's funny. Like, you have to get a joke, you have to be in on the kind of, like, material that it's covering, right? Okay. Later on, around 35 or so, maybe, she's talking about these three types of parodic procedures, and that's all she means by that is, like, three types of parodies that are created in things like this in music. So mapping, troping, and reversal are the three terms that she kind of defines here. And she gives a definition for each one, so let's go over them. So mapping would mean correlating a particular character or situation with a distinctive stylistic trope or topic. So if we're going to map something, then we're going to map one thing onto another thing, is what she means by that. Mapping a particular character or situation with a distinctive style or type or topic. Troping, here she says, juxtaposing or superimposing incongruous topics and types for creative synthesis. So that's that, like, kind of grotesque juxtaposition that I was just describing to you. And then negating or reversal, actually more specifically what I was just describing to you, reversal would be negating the topical referent of a given quotation through distorting its syntactical attributes. So playing Happy Birthday in a minor key would be an example of reversal, reversing the typical thing that it means to mean something spooky and weird. In that case. We're taking a scary piece of music, I don't know, and putting it with something happy. Like, I don't know if you've seen those YouTube videos where they'll take a preview for a horror movie, like The Shining, and just edit it differently and give it a different soundtrack and make it look like a preview for a romantic comedy. I'll try to find one of those to link to as well, because I think that does a good job of explaining what reversal is. And reversal is the one that I'm kind of the most interested in, because I think George Crumb does that. I think he will take, like a familiar American folk song that has like really positive, upbeat kind of characteristics and put it in a spooky setting, and all of a sudden its meaning changes a lot. Mapping, troping, and reversal. She, at one point on page 43, she refers to Ligeti's work as a multi-layered collage texture, and musical collage is another one of these things where we're taking quotes and styles from different pre-existing sources, or if it's not a direct quotation, maybe it's just a Baroque style fugue. It doesn't have to be an actual fugue for that to carry some of the same kind of general meanings as like a Bach fugue or something. Layering all of those things together, and sometimes with newly composed music as well. So she kind of builds that topic to talk about infinite accretion, citing S.T. Scheinberg's work about Bakhtin. And she describes infinite accretion as the process that accepts and affirms all contradictory data as part of one large, rich, varied picture. So the Bach fugue, or a fugue like Bach's, and part of a horror movie soundtrack, and a folk song don't go together. But infinite accretion is they're all together. Infinite types of sources could exist in the same piece, and it could make sense in the context of the grotesque. So this opera is pretty off the wall, and I will try to find, I used to have a couple of YouTube links to scenes from it, just so that you could see it, because really it is hard to even fathom it. As you can read about from page about 51, 52 onward, it's really hard to envision it without having like just seen even a clip or a shot of the set or something. And one important thing to keep in mind with this opera is that Everett makes a big deal about ambivalence, that the plot does not really follow kind of a typical plot structure, a narrative structure. There's no real closure in the opera, and the fact that so many of those narrative points are that ambiguous might make you uncomfortable as you experience it as an audience member, because we're used to having like really set things happen in the course of a story, which is what opera typically is for us. But that is not what's happening in this piece of music at all. So, I mean, there's characters and they sort of do things, but they don't really live in the normal world, and things don't really resolve for them. Like, even in an opera where it's like a cliche that the soprano has to die at the end, like there's not even really a point where something like that would happen in this opera. That kind of ambivalence is a technique that Ligeti is using to shape your listening experience, and at the same time kind of critique other kinds of opera. One of her other big points, I noted on page 53, the parodic procedures are systematically correlated with oppositional expressive states. So again, when we talk about markedness, like she talks about markedness on this page, when we say markedness, I want you to keep in mind, like, markedness, I think of the word something being markedly different. It's marked, or it's marked in the sense that it stands out to you. It's not something that you would normally see. If you are in a crowd of people and everybody is wearing CSU t-shirts, if you're at like a football game or something, and there's one person in the same section as you who has on a Boulder t-shirt, that person is marked. You're going to notice that they are different than everything else around them. And that could apply to any social situation or anything that's happening in like a piece of music or something like that. Like mode mixture, you could say, is markedness. Like the Picardy third, for example, at the end of a piece in a minor key, then we end with a major one chord, and that's marked. It's marked as in it is different from what you would expect. And so she refers to markedness. I wanted to make sure you knew what that term kind of meant. But I want to read that part again to you from 53. The parodic procedures, so the ways that he engages in parody in his compositions, Ligeti, the parodic procedures are systematically correlated with oppositional expressive states. So if he's going to parody, I keep coming back to the idea of a Bach fugue. I don't think that there actually legitimately is one in the piece, but imagine that. Just like keep it in your mind as an example. He's always going to pair something like a Bach fugue, which might be kind of busy, relatively tonal compared to the 20th century styles that are in the rest of the opera. He's always going to pair something like a Baroque fugue with something completely different, what she refers to here as an oppositional expressive state. Something with just like a completely different affect, completely different meaning, different feel, different tempo, not tonal, for example. Or if he uses a major key fugue, maybe this would be something that's like very, very dissonant. Like, so it's just the idea is that they're always going to be like this. He's always going to take something and parody it and then pair it with something where it just like, makes no sense to put those two things together, because that creates a new kind of meaning or a new kind of expression. She cites someone on 55 then referring to something like this as oppositional postmodernism, which is concerned with a critical deconstruction of tradition, not an instrumental pastiche of pop or pseudo-historical forms, but the idea is like deconstructing what a Bach fugue might even mean ever, not just when it's in a highly satirized environment. Deconstruction of tradition, not just sort of pastiche for its own sake. So this article has a lot going on, and it might be very confusing. And if you don't understand every bit of it, don't fret about that. But you might need to read some parts of it a couple of times to really grasp her points. And a lot of the kind of more semiotic technical things that she's talking about, like troping, topics, those kinds of meaning, parody, etc., we're going to come back to. We're definitely going to talk about those some more. So, this is your sort of being thrown into the deep end with some of those terms, because this topic in this particular article is really dense. Like, this opera is very layered and complicated. And, she has to use all of these different discussions of parody and such and the grotesque to unpack what is even happening in this opera. But we will definitely return to a lot of the same themes in other stuff we're reading, just in a little bit different context. So I'll post some discussion questions in the Canvas discussion page, and I hope that you'll participate in the discussion. If you have questions for me based on stuff that I've said, you can post them there too. If it's something that you'd rather not everyone else see, then I suppose you can definitely email me directly. But I'd be happy to continue this conversation in the discussion thread. So that's all for now, and I will be back again soon. Bye.